So this morning we began with a very precise and sobering picture, the global picture of the problem of displaced persons and refugees, and the different attempts to answer this challenge and the gap between the demand and the supply. Then we had a panel on looking at the normative and practical resources that faith communities bring to this issue. And now we are going to look at more concretely local, not at the global level, but the local level, how these global crises present themselves in different contexts. And first is going to be Ellen Goldstein, who has been worked for a very long time in the World Bank on the issue of Rohingyas, refugees in Bangladesh and in Myanmar, before work in the Western Balkans, which means, of course, a history also of inter-ethnic, inter-religious conflicts, and the way in which after war reconciliation took place. So Ellen, please.
Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. Well, thank you, Jose, for that introduction. And as he said, I spent about 40 years on the front lines of official foreign aid delivery, working for organizations for most of the time for the World Bank. And I had the opportunity in what was a very long and interesting career to be the country director for Bangladesh at one point, and then in my last assignment to be the director for operations in Myanmar around the time when the so-called Rohingya crisis really escalated. And I gained a tiny bit of notoriety by deciding to write a book about that last experience, the experience in Myanmar. And this is the book, Damned If You Do. And as you can see from the, I pulled one quote from a book review. You can see the intensity of the discussions around response to this particular human rights and refugee crisis. I went to Myanmar in 2017 at a time of tremendous optimism about the country's future as a democracy and as a, to rejoin the global community after decades of a brutal military regime. And essentially, those hopes were almost immediately dashed when the military engaged in a really ruthless campaign against the Rohingya minority, a Muslim minority in what is a Buddhist-dominated country. Actually, I'm not going to speak to the detail on my slides because of the time constraints, but I will highlight a few points from each of the slides for you. Just for those that don't really remember what the Rohingya crisis is, it really, in 2017, the military engaged in gross human rights abuses, genocidal intent toward this Muslim minority in Myanmar, which led not only to thousands of deaths, but also to 750,000 refugees fleeing across the Naf River into Bangladesh. Where they remain today in some of the largest, I think Anna earlier today said the largest refugee camp in the world, but also one of the most precarious refugee camps in the world. They remain in Bangladesh. There really is not a path to integration for these refugees in Bangladesh. And then in addition, there are about 500,000 Rohingya remaining in Myanmar who, since the military coup in 2021, their situation, which was characterized by extreme discrimination, exclusion, and violence, has only gotten worse. So, having been invited to speak here, I really reflected even more than I usually do on the role that religion has played in this crisis. And I will say that my responses to the Rohingya crisis when I was in Myanmar were very much shaped by my own upbringing as an American Jew who was raised on, Holocaust history of, never again, we must say something, we must do something, we must speak out. But it was interesting because when I really think in a very broad sense about the role of religion and faith in this Rohingya crisis, I have to say that the wonderful work which all of the organizations do that we've heard about today, which is sort of my bottom point on this slide, all of that wonderful work with the refugees and with those suffering in Myanmar comes after a fairly long list of ways in which religion has not helped, or in fact has been a determinant or an inciting factor in this violence and atrocities toward the Rohingya. In particular, just to point out, you had decades under the military regime up until around 2011, in which they systematically were othering Muslims, particularly the Rohingya, within the country, and creating public opinion that really viewed the Rohingya as subhuman, second-class citizens without normal civil rights. And the military really worked to encourage a kind of very violent Buddhist nationalism that reinforced that way of thinking. Once the crisis exploded, there was a marked lack of solidarity, both in terms of the reluctance of Bangladesh to sustain the refugees, although they have done so, but they have done so under quite a bit of international pressure, and they have done so in a way that does not allow for the refugees to really have a path to integration and a path to a dignified life. But also, as we saw earlier this morning, there has been almost no third country, resettlement, or whether from Muslim-dominated countries nor from, say, Western democracies, Christian-dominated countries. So, religion has played a role, but it has been quite a mixed role. But now, of course, there are faith-based organizations of all kinds on the ground, particularly in Bangladesh, in the refugee camps. Obviously, now under a very violent military regime and ongoing resistance and civil war in Myanmar, there is very little going on in Myanmar right now by faith-based organizations. Now, as I said, I was with the World Bank. So let me tell you just a tiny bit, and because I think that's the value added that I can bring today. Let me just tell you a little bit about how the World Bank responded as sort of a symbol of how official development agencies, all of them, some of the challenges that they faced. In Myanmar, as long as we had a quasi-democratic government in place there, and were very active there, we chose, and in this case I chose, because I was leading the program, I chose to stay engaged as the Rohingya crisis escalated, but I chose to make a fundamental shift in how we did business in Myanmar so that we were focusing explicitly on social inclusion in the ethnic minority areas. And that seems maybe obvious, but at the time, the World Bank has a mandate to eliminate poverty, and we were working to do that, but doing so in an aggregate sense without a specific focus on this issue of exclusion of minorities, which was actually a driver of conflict and also of the most extreme and severe deprivation in the country. So we chose to stay engaged. Now, after the coup, in 2021, the World Bank froze its most of its support to Myanmar because there was no longer a legitimate government. And again, you sort of have to understand that, as a UN agency, the World Bank has to work through its shareholders. It has to work through governments. So once there was a coup, it was deemed an illegitimate government, and most of the aid program was frozen with a few exceptions that I can talk about later. Now, on the Bangladesh side, there was huge international pressure to avoid the refoulements of the past. In the past, Bangladesh had really force-marched the Rohingya back into Myanmar. They had no desire to have them remain in a country which, of course, has the world's highest population density, has a high level of poverty. I mean, Bangladesh has a significant number of issues themselves that they need to deal with. So the international community essentially, rather than opening their doors to the Rohingya, chose to really finance Bangladesh to basically keep the Rohingya there. So, and the World Bank doubled its aid to Bangladesh and essentially gave $1.2 billion, which sounds like a lot, but is actually relatively small, over the past, since 2017, out of the refugee and host country and host community window for Bangladesh. Now, the final points I wanted to make are really the ones that I think we should talk about, and that is what are some of the challenges and what are the opportunities when we talk about how official development agencies address the refugee and displacement problem. And I think the number one challenge, well, there's three major ones, and then I'll stop. The first one, and I think Mohammed referred to it a little bit this morning in terms of structural rigidities. All of these organizations were created after World War II, and they are essentially built around a country-based model. And that's not just the financing flows, which is important that those are country-based, but it's also just the institutional structures of the organizations. The staffing, everything is around a country-based model. And it makes it very difficult to envision and to implement, as I tried to do to a certain extent, flexible, global, and regional solutions to problems that transcend country boundaries. So that's really the first thing. The second thing, of course, is this government orientation, which is built into these organizations. Now, what that means is that it is somewhat difficult to deal with non-state actors, civil society organizations, et cetera, and also faith-based organizations. So greater flexibility in dealing with non-state actors is something, it's a place where I think official development agencies can go, but there's still a long way to go in getting there. And I think the last one I'm going to highlight, and I'll end there, I think it's a good place to end, is that, for many, many decades, organizations like the World Bank really viewed conflict and displacement as temporary distractions from the development agenda, right? I mean, it was terribly unfortunate, it was sad, humanitarian agencies would jump in, but population movement was not really central to the long-term strategizing and planning for development. And in today's world, with the global polycrisis, with climate change and conflict, and the rise in the number of displaced, as we've seen, over and over again today, we have to think of displacement as a factor that needs to be integrated and built into long-term development planning. And we're a long way at this point from doing that in official development agencies. So with that, I'll stop. I'm sorry I took a little too much time, but thank you very much.
To the right. I'm the right wing here. Okay. Well, it's a great honor to moderate this final session. I'm Jose Casanova, a emeritus professor here at Georgetown of sociology and theology, but still an active senior fellow at the Berkley Center. And it's a great honor because look at these faces. Women are the leaders, practically in addressing global challenges today, especially women religious, but also lay religious women. So both women religious and lay religious women. And also partly what the Catholic Church has to offer, and I think Islam, those are transnational religions. And those, whether it is women religions, male religious, or Catholic religious movements, are transnational. They do not respect borders. And so therefore they are not embedded only in this national imaginary. And so I think that's very important. The experience they have of working across borders is a normal thing that we look at it carefully. And so to understand these different cases, we have, we said Paola is going to be next. Paola Piscitelli is the president of the Comunità San Egidio, Community of San Egidio, USA. Again, an example of a social movement, lay Catholic movement that started in Italy, but has become a global movement at the forefront of peacemaking, and the culture of the encounter around the world. Then comes Sister Norma Pimentel, is a friend of Georgetown, has been very frequently with us in sessions working on issues of the southern border, the refugee. She's one of the critical leaders, religious leaders working in the southern border. Is director of Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley and the leader of the Humanitarian Respite Center for Families Fleeing Violence in Central America. And finally, Asa Karam, who has been working also on the barricades and the frontier issues for many, I would say, decades. First with the United Nations, then as president of Religions for Peace, and now with Lead Integrity. So please, Paola, you go first.
I will go there
please,
if you don't mind.
Please, feel free,
with the
wherever you feel most comfortable.
Piece of paper, it's easier. So thank you for this event, for having me here, for all the wonderful speakers that spoke before me, and which will cut my first part of intervention, giving the background and the numbers as we heard deeply this morning. I will start sharing the experience of the humanitarian corridors, which is mainly a European experience, I would say, which is an example of a practical ecumenism at the service of the poor, expressed by a shared commitment of the community of Sant'Egidio, of the Federation of the Evangelic Churches, and the Valdensians Table, all Protestant movement in Italy. It started in 2014, where we heard of the drama of the Mediterranean dying and all those dying at seas, and at the same time the hardening of the migratory politics in Europe. So in that year, in 2014, the community of Sant'Egidio shared with the other Protestant movements this idea of the humanitarian corridors. And Paolo Naso, who was leading the Protestant churches at that time, remembers those first steps in saying, and I quote, "Protestant and Catholics decided that the challenges should be faced together, ecumenically. The problem was not if to do something, but what to do." And Daniela Pompei, representative of the community of Sant'Egidio, refers to a well-known passage of the Gospel, for those who know of the Gospel of Luke, about the rich man who end up in hell. And she said, "The hell in which the rich man ends is not the result of the presence of the poor Lazarus at his door. Rather, the hell of the rich man is the unavoidable consequence of his door stubbornly closing out the pain of others. It is the drama of this rich man who has everything but cannot even be of use to his family. The drama we are living is that of a Europe rich in values, in individual and collective rights, which is not able to transmit and share anymore. End of quote. But this dimension, religious dimension of the humanitarian corridors is not only Christians. There is a strong cooperation with the Union of Jewish Communities in Italy, which has supported a number of university scholarship of Afghani Shia refugees arriving in Italy with the humanitarian corridors, and they were arriving from Pakistan and Iran. Today, after 7 years from the starting, we have welcomed 7,514 refugees, and obviously more are coming. The number may seem small, but it's actually larger than the official resettlement in Europe countries in these years. The humanitarian corridors are active in France, Italy, Belgium, and the refugees arrive from the Horn of Africa through Ethiopia. They arrive from Afghan through Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey, and they are those from sub-Saharan Africa through Libya and Niger. In addition, we are open and we travel also to the camps, to the refugee camps in Greece, Cyprus, and along the Balkan route. But what is the specific of the humanitarian corridors? What is the center of that? The program is addressed to refugees in vulnerable conditions. The program identifies them, takes charge of them, flies them to their destination country, and provides welcome and assistance for integration. It usually takes 1 year for the integration, but it may take all the time is needed. In the agreement that the association make with the state, with the government, it is clear that the organization operating the humanitarian corridors take complete responsibility for the choice of the beneficiaries, the free travel, and the integration in the resettlement country. Safety for the refugee as well for the hosting countries is paramount. Andrea Riccardi, who is the founder of the community of Sant'Egidio, once in 2017, opening the humanitarian corridors in France, said, "The experience of the humanitarian corridors shows that integration protects more than walls." We should make that clear. If we want to say of the secret of the humanitarian corridors, if we can call it that way, it's the threefold aspect. There is the refugee, the host, and the coordinators of the program. And so the first is the identification of the refugees. How can you choose among so many and so many requests that we receive? And we use obviously the definition of vulnerability of the European norms, which include all the vulnerable people, the disabled, minors, elderly, sick, and so on, and also the women victims of genital mutilation. The coordinators of the program do several trips to the camps. They have great experience, and so they pick the people that should come. But then the other aspect, it's also the welcoming family or group. We work with families, we work with churches, we work with association, because the refugee should be introduced and accepted. It's like an adoptive process. You cannot just throw a person into a family, into a situation, but you have to find a mutual ground of agreement. And this sometimes takes time, because you have to go back and forth. But this is a paramount in the success of the integration. And the third aspect is the stability of the coordinators of the program and the cultural mediators who help in the process. This is very important because it guarantees the faithfulness and knowledge of a situation. It is the same coordinators who go in the camp, identify the people, prepare them, and then accompany them through the resettlement. The most important aspect of the entire program is to transmit the spirit of the corridors. The corridors are built together in a relation of trust. While in the refugee camp or a government structure, you must either unwilling adapt or protest, you can talk with your sponsor of the humanitarian corridors and find a point of mediation. Importantly, the benefits of the humanitarian corridors are high levels of hospitality, as all are welcome in their own way. Training courses on the country of destination, including language, are provided months before departure to prepare the guest for the travel of their life. The friendship that is established during this process accompanies them in their journey. It is worth saying that welcoming people fleeing from war also means sowing seeds of peace. Among such meaningful stories, we may mention the Muslim volunteers of Genti di Pace, People of Peace, a movement connected to the School of Italian Language and Culture of the community of Sant'Egidio, which have helped many Christians who fled the violence of Islamic terrorism. Or the choice of the Union of Jewish Communities of Italy and Milan, who welcomed together a Muslim family from Aleppo in January 2020. Jewish and Christians welcome Muslim refugees from the Middle East together is an event with a powerful cultural message, both internally and externally to individual communities. Concluding, the humanitarian corridors have effectively integrated beneficiaries to the resettlement communities. This has been done thanks to the availability of various resources of civil society, involved in a long-term process that starts even before the refugees leave their transit country. The modalities of the program agreements with the governments protect human beings from traffickers and allow safe travel and processes of integration. The humanitarian corridors, though, are not a standardized institutional activity, are not provided by the state, but rather they happen in quantity and in quality, depending on the greater or lesser generosity of civil society. In this sense, their growth depends and will depend on the humanity of all people and the goodwill of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. Thank you so much. Thank you. Sister Pimentel, please. Here or here, wherever.
I'm fine, right here.
Good, good.
Muchas gracias. Well, I come from South Texas, the border with Mexico. I'm a native of the Rio Grande Valley. We call it El Valle. And because I'm from there, I lived all my life there at the border, and I'm so immersed in the experience of immigrants being part of who we are, you know. And I myself my dad came to the United States just as a trying out whether, what do I need to do to live in the United States? And he at that time, everyone that lived in Mexico in the border towns can just very easily have like a, what we call pasaporte, but it's an ID that will give you permission to be in the United States, just to go shopping and things like that. So he got permission to live in the United States, so I was born in the United States. And so, but in any way, we go back and forth. My communities, we are so involved in both sides. Early in the 80s, when I entered religious life, the diocese, the church, the Catholic Church was very involved with receiving so many immigrants coming back then to the United States, mostly from Central America, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras. Those was basically fleeing because of the war that was going on in those countries. And we took a non-political position as a church to be responsive to the many immigrants that were just crossing the river and ending up in a shelter that Bishop asked us, the Missionaries of Jesus, to take responsibility and care for the immigrants. And we did that for 10 years. At the time, it was interesting how I was very young, you know, and just pretty much had just entered religious life and had finished my formation. And I was living there at the shelter with Sister Juliana Garcia, who was the head of our religious community. And what was, for me, was everything was just like a sponge absorbing all that was happening and not trying to understand what that all meant. And so what I observed is how the church took a stance in defending the response of caring for the stranger, feeding them. And it was like our Bishop, John Fitzpatrick at the time, simply when he was so controversial about why did he take this stance, why was he helping illegal aliens. And he said, there's nothing wrong that we do when we feed somebody or give somebody to drink or help them find a space that is safe and they can rest. So from there, the church took a big blow in response from the community because we were helping illegal aliens. Many of them chose that were contributors to their Sunday donations to just simply not support the Catholic Church, And the bishop's position was what he was doing was the right thing, and he continued to take that stance. 25 years later, we come to the present, 2014, where we start seeing a great migration of families in the thousands, mostly children. And taking the lead as head of Catholic Charities, the community was so engaged in wanting to do something and help out these many families that we were finding out in the streets of the bus station, where Border Patrol had released them to the community so they can proceed their legal proceedings wherever they were going. And we took a position as church and as a community, because every single denomination of faith communities was present in wanting to help out and respond to these many families, who we were mostly seeing families with children. And we did together as a community. Everybody supported. Even the law enforcement, the local governments, the Border Patrol, we all kind of partnered together to be one community, one church as well, because we supported the fact that when I was asked initially by the local government saying, what are you doing here, Sister Norma, at the local parish that was very close to the bus station. We had the parish hall packed with refugees, with families, helping families. The response was overwhelmingly positive from the people, from the community. And as my bishop always says, it's because we are a people with a big heart. Everybody helped, And my response was, as I looked at everybody, it said, we are restoring human dignity. That's what we're doing, And that response triggered a very positive response from the local law enforcement, by the local government, in saying, how can we help you? How can we join you in this effort to help restore human dignity? And that's what I've seen since day one when we started 10 years ago. Our response has been so unified and so supportive that our community in South Texas is a community that believes that we live out our faith by being present, by encountering the other, by that personal come and see and experience and see why these families are here. Who are they? Why are they even in our community? And when we meet them, it's like one experience that I had once with a young lady who came over to the shelter and said to me, Sister, I'm 100% against what you're doing, helping these illegal aliens. And I said, thank you for letting me know. Let me tell you why I do this and who they are. So I introduced her and I had her meet families and explain to them why they were there. When she turns around and looks at me and she says, I am 100% in favor of what you're doing, 100%. And that evening I got a call from her husband, and he said to me, Sister, I don't know what you did to my wife, but she came home today after work, and she said, if Sister ever calls you, you make sure you do what she says. So I'm calling you to ask you, if you need anything from me, let me know. I'm here to help. I see the impact, how much we hear today, how many people are so against immigrants and this negative attitude towards immigrants. I believe it's because they have not allowed themselves to get close enough and to meet that child. And we talked about how the last panel mentioned about how how he said, oh, they're all bad people except for Tomas because, he works with me, or is that close proximity to that person or them, or that family that makes us triggered and understand the importance of caring for the other. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Asa, you've been in many different places dealing with those issues, so tell us.
Great, thank you.
About
Thank
your
you very much.
experience.
Thank you very much. It's honestly a pleasure and an honor to be with you all here today. And thank you to my two professors and mentors, Professor Catherine Marshall and Professor Jose Casanova, from whom I have learned plenty over the years. So many, many thanks for the inclusion. A couple of points. I first, just to, if you'll please allow me, Jose, the term Islamic terrorism is not a very gracious nor a very accurate term in any way, shape, or form. And I think being considerate of those kinds of terms and what they evoke in Muslims might be a good thing to bear in mind. I think it makes a lot of sense not to speak about Jewish terrorism or Christian terrorism. And similarly, also, it would be incorrect to talk about Islamic terrorism. So just a point for the record, because I couldn't possibly overlook it. I first got involved with issues of religious engagement on issues of development, humanitarian relief, and human rights when I worked in the UN, and it was literally on the very first day of joining UNDP and being with the then administrator, Mark Malloch Brown, when he needed advice on a letter he had received. Kindly note that the date is now July of 2004. And it was a letter written to the administrator of the United Nations Development Program from the then head of Islamic Relief Worldwide, Dr. Hani al-Banna. And the letter was basically beseeching UNDP administrator to help liaise with certain governments in the UN system. The UN system is all governmental, as Ellen pointed out, and therefore they are as good as or not as good as the governments themselves. Just a point of note. It was literally beseeching. He says, I beg you, I remember that phrase very clearly, I beg you to please intervene. And he named the governments in question, and they were from the Western Hemisphere, you can imagine which ones, from the Western Hemisphere and from the Gulf, who were making Islamic Relief's humanitarian work extraordinarily difficult because they were halting and making it difficult to access funding and resources. That was Islamic Relief's money, but they were making it extremely difficult to get access to the money and by extension to be able to implement programs and projects and initiatives of a humanitarian nature. Why? Because this was still the height of the anxiety created by September the 11th, 2001, and the concern that Muslim organizations in particular were somehow culpable for terrorist financing and funding. What is interesting is that this head of Islamic Relief felt it was important to beseech a UN entity, and not surprisingly, the one that does a lot of the development work at that point. The similar letter was sent to UNHCR, I later learned. But what was interesting was to see the response. And this will matter because I'm going to make another point in a second. But the response from both UNDP and UNHCR was, honestly, none of our business. We can't interfere or have an opinion about what NGOs are doing or not doing. And if they're religious NGOs, and particularly if they're Muslim NGOs, the environment around us is such that it wouldn't be wise to appear to be supporting or standing alongside or appearing to defend any NGO. A year later, another Christian NGO sends a similar letter to Mark Malloch Brown in UNDP, at which point he feels obliged to do something. for that particular Christian NGO. So the logic of, well, they're NGOs, they're religious, we shouldn't really be seen to side, seemed to only be relevant to this particular Muslim context. Why is this significant? You can imagine why it is significant, but let me just say that 15 years later, UNDP and UNHCR have set up very expensive units at a time when they are supposed to be cutting down on expenditures and staff. They set up 2 very expensive units to ensure that they could harvest Islamic finance, because there's a lot of money in that space and it needs to be milked. So if you can see the contrast in that approach and attitude, it will give you a bit of an insight as to what is fundamentally wrong in our international system, as well as, frankly, in the way that some of us work within the NGO community. When I, as my own initiative at that time, reached out to Islamic Relief and to a number of other religious NGOs to say, can you not show solidarity yourselves, please, given that there seems to be this issue, I got pretty much a similar response from the other religious NGOs. We're not aware, we don't know, it's not our issue, it's not our responsibility. I dare say that approach would not be unusual today either. So when we speak about the challenges of humanitarian engagement, and we keep talking about how wonderful faith-based organizations are, because they are, we need to keep in mind that that basic admonition to welcome the stranger doesn't quite apply when it comes to other religious NGOs who come from other religions, who are not from our same religious background, that the NGOs are as culpable as some of the governments are. And I'm sorry, it's unpleasant, it's not nice to say, but it is just a truth that I think we need to be aware of. David Miliband, the head of the IRC, a couple of years ago, was very honest in saying, we have to understand that the bulk of those who are displaced and refugees as a result of the many conflicts, including obviously Myanmar, but also Syria at that time, etc. He said, we need to appreciate that the bulk of them are actually Muslims. What he didn't say, that I completed for him much to his chagrin, was, I wonder if that impacts on the way we're behaving towards so-called welcoming those particular strangers. Because you see, even if it isn't correct, even if it's our approach towards others from other religions who happen to be Muslim, even if my contention that it has something to do with why we're facing some of these challenges in the humanitarian space, even if it's not true, the question does need to be asked. And I say this because I have seen the other side. I've worked from within the intergovernmental and even the interreligious spaces. And I have noticed that there's a great deal of talk and conversation about how we all love one another, especially in the interfaith space. We all love one another so much. We see each other as delightful equals in the eyes of the divine or the creator or the Lord or whatever the terminology happens to be. But when it comes to certain Muslim people, we might have a few more criteria that need to be applied. God help you if they're Muslim women, and God help you more if they're Arab Muslim women, because then there's a gazillion criteria that need to be applied, which are not always easy to face. The moral of the story is this. We're sitting here and wondering about what on earth is going to happen as of January the 20th. We've already had 4 years of a similar administration. We have promises that this will be an even more vindictive administration. And my question is, if we had a challenge between one another as people of faith, if we found it difficult really to stomach one another as people of faith, different faiths, will we be easier on one another this time around? Will we genuinely take up the issue of solidarity? And please note, Muslims have voted for this incoming administration in quite significant numbers, and some didn't vote at all because they didn't like the options that they were given. So it's not to say Muslims are all good and it's non-Muslims who have a problem. No, I'm very, very sorry. When I worked in the interfaith world, the people who were the last to stand alongside me as a Muslim woman were the Muslims. I never heard anything from them. So I think it's important for us to be self-critical, rather than just keep pointing the finger at others. We have a responsibility to bear. Our responsibility becomes greater. And yes, it is absolutely about the personal narratives and the stories and the communities, but it is also about finally perhaps beginning to come to terms with a colonial legacy that we are all part of. And even as Muslims, as Arabs, as people from different countries, we have a colonized mindset ourselves. At what point and what will it take for us to be extraordinarily brave and honest in acknowledging our own deficiencies towards one another? Because it isn't that any one religious community is all good, another religious community is all bad, and it isn't that the interfaith and multi-faith spaces are spaces of mercy, which they should be. It may be that some of those same spaces are also where the greatest wounds against one another as immigrants can be inflicted. Can we think about that too?
Well, thank you, Assam, for these critical remarks from somebody who has been working in many different contexts and for many years. So I want to give the opportunity to the other panelists to respond. I want to point out, you, Ellen, mentioned the recognition at one point that the question of refugees is not something separate, it's not a temporary thing, it's not something that's going to go away, but it's part of the whole development question. So the World Bank should not simply have something to react when it happens, but it should integrate it into the whole development policy. I think that it's very clear that what we heard today about the gap between the increasing challenges and the limited responses has to do with the fact that it's not anymore just a crisis that just happened now, temporary, but it's a permanent systemic issue that we have to address systemically. And I think that we have to recognize that neither the international system of nation states nor the world economic system can have been able to address it. Here I'm going to repeat the words of Pope Francis I mentioned before, when in Laudato Si he says, if we think that all we need to do to address this, to respond to these global challenges, is just to reform one thing here and there, and to simply tweak whatever we've been doing and doing better, we are denying reality. So it forces us to think much more creatively and more critically of ourselves. It's not what we are doing at the local level is very important, but if we don't address the larger issues and the way all the problems are interconnected, from what causes the refugee crisis, through the process of going through, I mean, the transition times and periods and refugee camps through which they go through, and then the settling countries, it all has to be an integrated response. And most importantly, I think, it cannot be simply a reactive response. It will have to be a proactive. We have to think in terms of how to fix the whole issue, to think basically holistically of the whole issue. So on this, I want you to basically add your thoughts.
Agree with that? Yes. Yeah. Well, what I would say, first of all, is I think it is important to recognize that there has been progress in trying to come up with ways to address what we call global public goods and global public bads. I mean, I'm not by any means the first person to say that, you know, one of the problems is this very country-based and nation-state-based approach to foreign aid, whether it's humanitarian or development. So the lack of systematic financial flows to deal with global problems like climate change, but also like forced migration, is one of the issues. The lack of institutional structures that can deal with these problems across borders is an issue. I think this morning Faith raised a very good point that I also had somewhere in my slides, that there are so many new technologies that allow, you know, it used to be that a refugee left country A and hopefully eventually landed in country B, and there was almost like a wall between those two places, and there, you know, when in reality now, everybody is a global citizen. Everybody is connected. There are many, many ways in which we can use technology to, different types of technology also, to create economic opportunity, to create better access to services, et cetera, for refugees. So I don't want to be overly negative. What I want to say is really that we have an opportunity to try to reshape the larger structures in ways that are going to help us solve problems that we can no longer pretend are peripheral. It's a core issue. It's going to be a core issue. Nothing about what we're doing, say, today on climate change is going to change that in the very near future. So, let's roll up our sleeves and really get to work on it.
The Comunità San Egidio is a global community now, and it has gained experience from all these crises all around the globe. So how can the Comunità San Egidio think in ways of becoming even more cooperative with one another, communities, and so in a way that they can help?
I mean, how to be, I think it's really a matter of encountering and encountering and encountering and not getting tired of doing it. It's not stopping at the first difficulties, facing them. When we were speaking this morning about migration and the issue of the world, I was thinking of peace and how much the community has been involved also in grounds in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Algeria, in many countries where it's not easy and has not been easy. But the effort is not to give up and to create occasion like this in which you really have the space to encounter the others. And as Sister says, when you encounter the others, things change. And I think that we learn how to talk, we learn how to respect, or we try, at least we try our best. The problem is also to accept that there is this effort on the other side. And so I think that the example of people working together on the ground, of having responsibilities shared together in different countries, it's really a great example of where we can go and grow in that sense. So.
There are probably hundreds and hundreds of religious sisters, movements, organizations around the world. Can they work together also much more?
We are actually. I think there's a big effort that is done worldwide that's bringing us together, that is really trying to convene all of us from every continent. And I've been in many of those convenings, and the effort is to try to identify, understand the reality of somebody else from another country, so that how we are so similar and how we can support each other. So definitely encounter is key in understanding, and that's what changes the mind and the heart of somebody who's totally, completely unaware of the reality of somebody else. Is so different. The only way to change that is to allow ourselves to come close and meet that reality. I think that's key to our conversion and to our coming together as one.
Right. And Asa, the Muslim Ummah is a global Ummah, and with a lot of also transnational resources, solidarity is very clear. So how can it be promoted more, as you are pointing out?
So I found out, and one of the many lessons I learned over my career is that often the sensitive issues, for instance, related to sexual and reproductive health and rights, can be extraordinarily divisive issues in general, but they can be extraordinarily divisive within religions. So very hard to find points of commonality within the Catholic faith, the Protestant faith, the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith. There's lots of issues there. But I have lived to see multiple times how coming together in a multi-faith context, bringing people from different religious groups to discuss the same set of contentious issues, can actually move the pendulum from absolutely not, this is what it is, this is what God wants, to, well, maybe we could be a bit more merciful about the way we understand what we think God wants. And I think it's that opportunity for more mercy towards dissonances that we see in the multi-religious that might be what we have to hold on now. Because now is not, I don't think, the right time to go back and say, all ye Muslims come together. I mean, why would they ever do that? 1.5 billion, for heaven's sake. Have all the Christians come together. So the idea that we would think we can now go into our respective shells that are a particular religious veneer, and we now need to come together in solidarity as Catholics, as Jews, as Muslims, as whatever. Honestly, that doesn't quite work that way. It's never worked before. What we might be challenged to do, and who knows, perhaps this, what some of us may feel as a blight that is taking place, perhaps that's an opportunity that will force us to be much more deliberate and intentional about coming together as multiple faith, as, and I think someone mentioned it this morning as well, not only as faith-based or faith-inspired, but much along the lines of Lead Integrity, which is the organization we co-founded, a number of us. We come together as faith-inspired, different faiths, from pagans to everything in between. We come together as faith-inspired because we have a common mission, a common vision for a world that is served by each of us individually and collectively, a world that needs a different kind of wisdom that can inform the existing systems, because systems are extremely difficult to undo, and we can't undo every single one we've got. But perhaps it is about the kind of wisdom that needs to be informing these different systems, if they'll listen. And what if it is deliberately not one faith, but multiple faiths, committed to the same vision of decency and justice and unity and diversity? That is a principle that I think we need to generalize. Honestly, Jose, I don't think that it is conceivable that 1.5 billion Muslims will all of a sudden find commonality, or that the rest of the 2.5 billion Catholics or Christians will find commonality. We will find commonality as people committed to faith, respective faiths, for a better society, and find commonality with the secular civil society that has been fighting alongside, and by the way, that is equally culpable of the kinds of decisions that we're seeing happening around us.
Thank you. We still have half an hour for conversation with the audience, questions and answers, comments. So please, there is, I think, a microphone, and please, yes.
Yeah, thank you. This panel is just piecing together some sort of questions that I had coming in, particularly on Trump's victory last week made it so clear how cross-coalitional, like the coalition that brought him to power was very intersectional, if I may use that word. And particularly in the border regions, he made significant inroads amongst Latino communities. I wonder if because I've not visited that part of the country nearly enough, and so to what extent, like perspective on that. And then the second question, which is, take your point around, David Miliband's comment, and then you completing it, which is I think is it's just brilliant. And what I find fascinating is that Ukraine offered, I think, an interesting parallel example about the way in which the international community banded together to be able to respond in volume to such an extent that was, in some ways, if you spoke to government officials, they said prior to that happening, it's never possible. We can't accept hundreds of thousands of people. That's ridiculous. But they were able to do it quite quickly and literally overnight. But at the same time, you have, so while there may be some recessive quality to the focus around displacement crises, like the Middle East is also serving actually as a very, very powerful place where international banks, the tech sector, and others are actually going to be able to secure investment at a moment where some of those investment money is sort of receding from other parts of the world, but because of the public investment funds of Qatar, of the Saudis, et cetera, you have multinational sectors basically flying at a whim to be able to grab some of that investment. How do you make sense of that? Big questions, but that's why we're here. We're here to ask big questions.
So I'll respond to the part of the border. And so, the border is one of the poorest areas, if not the poorest, in the United States. Many of the people there, great majority, if not most of them, are very poor and struggling economically tremendously. Mostly I accredit it to the pandemic. The results of the pandemic really brought prices up so high and livable. It's not possible for people to make ends meet. They have 2 or 3 jobs, and their work never increased in what they bring home, and so they struggle a lot. So economics, I think, played a strong part why the border all of a sudden turned red, as that's how they see it, right? Because they bordered for President Trump. And so I attribute it to that, even though, so also, of course, the other position was as far as immigrants having such a negative image of immigrants that it was so popular, and that could have had some effect. But I believe that economics and the struggle to survive and thinking and hopeful that this new president will actually make the economy better is something that everybody in our area struggles very big time.
Okay, so who would like to address the other?
If I can add to this aspect, to the question of the Latino, which is not only, I think, among Latinos, but I think also among some poorer part of the population. I know for sure in New York also, for example, we are serving unhoused people, and they voted for Trump, and you wonder why. And so I think in a part there is his narrative that is appearing like the savior. So it's a strong narrative of, looking for someone else who can save your problem, even in a simplistic way. On the other, I think there is a responsibility of all of us in bridging, in making that bridge towards this other part of the population, because if we keep separate, if we don't bridge to them, if we don't speak to them, if we don't welcome them in a true way with dignity, I think that's just going to increase. That's my part for this. I don't know much about the economic of the investment, so I will not respond on that, but I wanted to say about the internal discrimination within refugees. We saw that in Europe, even within Ukrainians. In Ukraine, there were many refugees from Africa, and they were stopped at the border. They were second-class refugees. The white Ukrainians were welcome, but not the black one. And so, unfortunately, it's a reality that many aspects of racism, discrimination, religious, whatever, do have an impact. We cannot deny that. I think why Sudan is not, under the radar as other countries. So that's, it's a question that invests a lot of hope. The answer is difficult to say because there is not an answer of 2 words. It's not an answer that we can fix with a magic wand. But I think it's to bring that to the attention continuously to the media, to our conversation, to include that in our response, in our actions, where we focus our actions and maybe target more these parts that are hidden and not so much in the focus of others.
So money and nation state.
Can we ask Mohammed to please say that question, his second question again? Can you just, thanks.
So at a moment where Muslim communities certainly, and other sort of countries around the world who are not white, or white passing even in some extent, to some extent the international community has not nearly concentrated focus enough, nor I think, or is exposing the hypocrisy and sometimes even racist hypocrisy of the very multilateral system whose job it is to protect people regardless of where it is that they come from. So on the one hand, you see that happening across the international system. On the other hand, you have, like to your point around like the point around Islamic financing. This juxtaposition I see, right, amongst the international system is again, I think, just reaffirms for me how just sometimes to the general public, how just ridiculous that all looks publicly. And I think that undermines public trust in the multilateral system in ways that might undermine its long-term sustainability and viability. So how do you make sense of that? How have you made sense of that, particularly of your experience over 2 decades?
Okay, so So thank you for the question. I think it is important to note, and I want to fully second what my colleagues on the panel have said, the issue of racism is rather vibrant and rife, including, in fact, especially in multinational, multiracial contexts and multilateral organizations. We think that that's where all perfection finally has happened. But what we don't seem to understand is the other side of the coin is that's where all the prejudices come together and manifest. So multilateral structure, per definition, is not where we found resolution to our prejudices. It is where we are enacting our prejudices with language and attitudes that is amazing. Subhanallah, yani we managed to camouflage everything in the nicest possible way, in the most formal language. But these are spaces, and the same applies to the multi-religious. These are spaces where the prejudices flower even more. What, they suddenly disappear? Why would they suddenly disappear? Is it not the same human beings? So we need to just be cognizant of that as just a reality. I'm not judging it good or bad. It's just what happens. What happens when people come together from different nationalities, different races, different ethnicities, and different religions is, yes, an opportunity to be better humans, but also a manifestation of the worst that we carry vis-a-vis and towards one another. Yes? So that's the reality. Work backwards to see how it is, which I have witnessed and sat in conversations to see how it is that Muslim majority countries, especially from certain parts of the world, come to the table saying, we want to give money to this institution's work. We want to support multilateral efforts. Sure, we have a few conditions, i.e., for instance, money does not go to this country. Money does not go to these people. Money does not go to issues dealing with that. Right? So there's just a few tiny conditions, but my goodness, the money that's coming. So even within a system that is meant to uphold human rights of all at all times, the promise and the need for the money means that you will, of course, compromise on this group of people, this set of issues, that particular country receiving assistance. You will compromise because you think you're getting the resources that you desperately need, and you're not getting what you need. You're getting some of it. You're getting it. So yes, okay, there's a compromise to be made here, there, and everywhere. Now, once you make that compromise, those of us who can have the luxury of looking from outside can then say, but once you start making those compromises, where do you stop? And that's the problem with multilateralism and multi-religious engagement. Well, multi-religious will always tell you, deeply held, widely shared, only what we agree on, and it's so much. Yes, great. What we disagree on is even more. But we're compromising with what we agree on. So that means that if you want to push us in a certain direction, but where some of us don't agree, and Ukraine, by the way, brought that out super duper clearly in the religious and the political worlds. Those who accepted Ukrainian refugees with a heartbeat, who had let people die from other parts of the world on their borders before, but they opened the borders for the Ukrainians, they were not countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America. They were countries right around who were also on what is the word in English? They were openly saying, these are people like us. So if it's people like us, we welcome them. But if it's people who are not like us, we have quotas, we have issues, we have dissonances. So I think Ukraine brought that out very clearly. In the political context, when the vote went to the General Assembly, it was very clear that there were going to be a number of countries who didn't give a hoot about what was going on. Ukraine is not their baby. It's not their problem. It's a problem of a certain part of the world, and they're up to here with having to pay for problems of that part of the world. And it went to the same situation within the religious institutions. Some religious institutions were gung-ho against what Russians were doing and the Russian Orthodox Church was doing, and others were like, not our business, not our problem. There was so little difference between the political reaction and the religious reaction.
Just to animate that, as an Afghan, I'll give you exactly what I experienced, which was Biden talking about Afghans. I just remember this. He was standing at a podium and he goes, well, Afghans, they didn't fight. They just fled. They didn't give a fight. They didn't put up a fight. When he talked about Ukrainians, he talked about, well, look at them. I mean, they're just courageous and resilient. And in the back of your mind, you have to offer some context there. Afghans have been fighting for 49 years, right? I just think like the duplicity, I just think that undermines public trust in that system. So it's just like, I certainly felt that, and I just wonder how much of that had to do with like faith ideology and just other sort of sentimental elements.
Okay, another questions, please? Anybody? Yes, David.
Could I ask Ellen Goldstein about going back on the Rohingya and Myanmar situation? You talked about the religious ambiguity of the role played there, and you highlighted about the role of the Myanmar Buddhists and what they did to drive the Rohingya from Myanmar. Could you say where that's coming from, the response of that community? I mean, whether it's coming from a sort of ethnic identity that sees themselves as so-called Burmese Buddhists, is it really, which is more on the Myanmar Burmese side, or is it coming more from the Buddhist side? I mean, I'm wondering about what's the role of Buddhism as a religion in relationship to what happened there vis-a-vis the Rohingya. We normally think of Buddhism as being a very pacifist and very welcoming religion and so forth, and this is a very opposite of that. And I know that the Buddhist religion is a complicated story, but I'm just wondering how you would unpack the role of Buddhism as a religion vis-a-vis the ethnicity and other national identity markers that caused the driving of the Rohingya from the country.
Yeah. Thanks. That's a complicated question, and I can by no means speak for the Buddhist faith, but what I can speak to is my observations from when I was there. And my understanding, like all religions of the world, there are, they exist on a spectrum. And I don't in any way mean to imply that Buddhists as a whole in Myanmar were engaged in this kind of radical Buddhist nationalism. However, there were certain parts, certain monks that had very nationalistic and very violent tendencies who continue to have quite a following within Myanmar. It is by no means all people in Myanmar. It is, most of them are in fact ethnic Burmese. There are other Buddhist minorities in Myanmar as well. But I place much of the blame, if you will, for the way things developed on 5 decades of an isolationist and brutal military regime, which was very astute in othering Muslims. For their own survival as a military regime, they needed the people of Myanmar, the many different ethnic groups, to believe that only the military was holding them together and preventing enemies from the outside, especially Muslim enemies from the outside, from taking over, from destroying the nation, et cetera, et cetera. And they spent many years and many resources, going through the education system, through radio, television, everything. I mean, the very sophisticated communications campaign, so that public opinion was invariably dominated by individuals who saw Muslims as a threat, and particularly the Rohingya as a threat, and as subhuman and as not deserving of the same rights of citizenship as anyone else in the country. So that is where things stood. And today, you have a situation where the so-called national unity government that exists in exile here in America since the coup and is trying to build, advocate for a future federal democracy, they have committed themselves to, full citizenship rights for the Rohingya, which is wonderful. At the same time, you have a civil war raging where a number of ethnic organizations are essentially winning the battle against the military, or at least inflicting a great deal of damage onto the military. And a lot of people are saying, hey, we're close. Pretty soon there will be a federal democracy with rights for everybody, et cetera. But the reality is that those different ethnic groups, most of them Buddhist, different types connected to different outside countries, et cetera, they have a vision for a great degree of autonomy in any future Myanmar state. And so it does really remain to be seen whether they can bind together all these diverse individuals in a nation that would grant the kinds of civil liberties and human rights to all peoples, including the Rohingya. It will be perhaps the bigger challenge than triumphing over the military.
Any other question, comment? Again, from the audience, from the panelists. Please, Catherine. You've been very quiet the whole day, Catherine.
I wanted to put to Aza the question of what reforms do you see? I mean, we've had the UN Pact for the Future. You've been on the commission, the Secretary General's commission, looking at multilateralism, and you have plenty of experience, but also plenty of wisdom about it. We've talked both about the personal, individual role in bringing change, but what about the more collective? Where do you see that going?
Thank you. I think one of the things I would share is that when the UN Secretary General put together a high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, the original name was supposed to be on public goods. And there was such a furore among some member states, some of whom are very busy waging war right now, about this idea of public good, because then it would mean that what certain governments consider their own goods would have to be seen from a different perspective as public goods. Territory, resources, natural resources, etc. So there was a massive backlash against the name of a special advisory board on public goods. So you can already imagine how limiting, if you will, that was to the whole notion of trying to argue for the collective common good. So instead it became ineffective multilateralism. And what I found particularly instructive in that space is how the real emphasis was on reforming international financial institutions. It really was just an attempt to say, how can we reform the way that money is being given to governments and others? How can we reform that? But that also was a bit too much for certain people, certain governments. So we ended up with this multilateralism, which frankly was extremely difficult to address. And yet at the same time, I think there was a brilliant report that came out. But what is even more interesting is to see how this was supposed to be in the lead up. The report was meant to inform the UN General Assembly that just completed in September. And in the meantime, the 60+ UN system entities, there are more than 60 entities that are belonging to the UN system, in case you think that blue building in Manhattan is all there is. One of them is the World Bank Group. Those then started to produce their own reports and advocacy data on different kinds of things, all of which actually fell under the rubric, generally speaking, of multilateralism, the public good, the whole tamasha. So I think the system ended up actually shooting itself in the foot by trying to improve, but trying to improve with all the different bodies at hand, that ultimately the message got completely diluted. The best we could do was the pact for the future. I think it's extremely clear that we are on the cusp, if we haven't fallen already, into the space where all our governmental institutions have a question mark next to them. I'm being very polite. There is a sense of the failure of government institutions, yes, and therefore of intergovernmental or multi-governmental institutions. By implication, there should also be an introspection amongst the non-governmental institutions, but we dare not go there, which is what I'm trying to say we really should do. Especially if the faith communities take the lead of being self-introspective, it might be actually a good, yeah, whatever. The point is, I think in terms of scenarios for the future, there is, I happen to be a Gramscian, don't all leave the room, please, don't all leave the room. Muslim and Gramscian might be a bit too much, but the notion that Gramsci said that when the persecution and oppression is at its height, that is also when the resistance and the resistances are at their height. And I see that manifesting. So the other side of the coin, I think, Catherine, is this opportunity to see how the non-governmental actors are trying to come together to be the alternative spaces for doing good and caring for the common good. You've heard the stories from many, and you are sitting in a space where you hear all the stories from so many different communities. But I think this is the moment when we begin to look to civil societies much more than we perhaps are looking towards government. Right. And we would have to hold civil societies accountable, which, by the way, nobody holds right now. There's no accountability for civil societies. There's actually accountability, some form of it, for governments, but there's no accountability for civil societies. But I think this is the moment when we have to, and the UN itself has come up very publicly, and it was in the report and many other reports, and the Pact for the Future is meant to symbolize this, that we're looking beyond the governments, yes, to the rest of the human world out there to see what can come together. Now, they're also looking towards the faith communities. The United Nations and many governments have looked and are looking and are actively partnering with faith communities. I don't think that when inefficient governance partners with religious entities, that is necessarily a recipe for goodness. I think it's a recipe for disaster, personally. But that is just my way of thinking. And that's why I'm saying it is incumbent upon the faith communities, the religious institutions, but other non-governmental organizations to manifest, be the exemplars in holding themselves accountable to a different standard of human rights than what has currently and what is currently enacting. If we can manifest that example, perhaps others will be more keen to believe.
I mean, from listening to you, I mean, what is missing is institutionalization of a global civil society, not one, because there will be many, but to create transnational institutions of civil society. Because precisely as long as we keep civil society within the boundaries of the nation state, we can also not create institutions. That's why I'm insisting that transnational religions that already have these transnational structures have a unique opportunity to institutionalize, to begin institutionalizing the kind of action that is needed. It's not only that they should, be exemplary, but really we have to be creative in creating new institutions. Neither the world system of nation states nor the world capitalist system are able to respond to these global challenges. It's very clear.
So there was an attempt and a lot of discussion within the UN system and in the General Assembly behind closed doors about precisely that attempt to try to see how to institutionalize civil society representation at the United Nations. And the best that they could come up with,
not at the United Nations,
was to have one representative who would be the special advisor for all of the world's civil societies.
Exactly.
One special representative, like they have with one rapporteur on this and one rapporteur on that, and this and that are the whole world. One representative, which of course was shot down after some severe conversations. But the challenge here now is that the reform of the UN, at least, is looked at from the perspective, again, of governments. That it's what the governments are willing to tolerate to be reform of their system, of their institution.
Yes.
And
That's why it cannot be reform of what we have. It has to be added alternative institutions that precisely have a voice in challenging what are otherwise the governing structures of global governance. So we have to create additional structures, not to supersede, because you cannot supersede neither the world capitalism nor the world system of states, but you cannot do the reform from any of the two. We have to create new structures.
But we also have to question what institutionalization looks like, because I think the existing institutions, as you were saying before, there's a systemic failure, systemic failures. So if we keep on institutionalizing using the same models, I'm not sure that that would necessarily be the best way to institutionalize.
Okay, wait. Any opinion on this conversation, on this debate? Multilateralism, multinationalism, transnationalism, you know. Well, let me thank, first of all, the panelists.
Thank you.
Again, for adding, yes, more voices and ideas to what we have been discussing the entire day. Let me thank all of you for being here with us. Let me thank the organizers, especially the people at the Berkley Center that put these things together and manage it. It makes possible that we have these events. And so thank you very much.